Let me tell you something strange about people who always see the good in others. We live in a world that calls this naive, a world that rewards skepticism, that applauds those who see through people, that treats trust like a weakness waiting to be exploited. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe you've been told you're too trusting, too soft, too willing to give second chances. And maybe no one has ever explained why you can't seem to stop. If you want to understand what you feel without labels and have language to explain yourself without justifying, subscribe. Here, we translate psychology into relief, not diagnosis. We speak about what lives beneath the surface, about the patterns that shape us in ways we've never quite named, because sometimes the hardest thing isn't being misunderstood by others. It's misunderstanding yourself. The world calls this innocence, sometimes foolishness. But what if it's neither? What if the ability to believe in goodness isn't blindness, but a form of emotional courage most people have forgotten how to access? What if it's not about what you don't see, but about what you choose to protect inside yourself? Because here's what nobody tells you. Seeing good in others isn't just about them. It's about refusing to let the world's cynicism colonize your inner life. It's about maintaining a quality of attention that most people lose by 30. And maybe, just maybe, it's one of the rarest forms of strength we have left. The world teaches us early, expect the worst, and you'll never be disappointed. Build walls, read between lines, assume ulterior motives. We're told that wisdom means suspicion, that maturity is measured by how quickly we stop believing in people. Optimism becomes something we're supposed to outgrow, like training wheels or fairy tales. The message is clear: trust is for children, and the real world belongs to those who know better. But here's the collision you live with every day. You know the world can be cruel, and still you wake up choosing to see light. You've been burned before, maybe many times, and yet something in you refuses to harden. While everyone around you is building armor, you're still showing up with an open hand. And the exhaustion isn't just from being disappointed. It's from living in a culture that treats your default setting as a defect. Social media amplifies this. We scroll through exposure after exposure of betrayal, disappointment, people showing their worst. The algorithm feeds us reasons to be suspicious, to protect ourselves, to assume the worst. Validation comes from clever cynicism, from the sharp takedown, from proving you weren't fooled. The dopamine hit comes from being right about someone's failure, not from being surprised by their goodness, and so you exist in this strange space, maintaining a way of seeing that the entire culture is designed to erode. It's not that you don't see the darkness, it's that you refuse to let it be the only story, but that refusal costs something, and most days no one seems to notice the price you're paying. Psychologists call this having a secure attachment to humanity itself. It's a baseline assumption that people are worthy of trust until proven otherwise, not because you're naive, but because you've somehow protected your capacity for primary trust. In other words, you haven't let the world's betrayals destroy your ability to begin with belief. Where others start with suspicion and make people earn their way to trust, you start with openness and adjust only when necessary. Research shows that people with this orientation actually have more accurate social perception, not less. You're not missing red flags, you're choosing which flags to give your attention to. You're operating from what's called an approach motivation rather than an avoidance motivation. While others are scanning for threats, you're calibrated to notice potential. It's not that you can't see danger. It's that your nervous system hasn't made danger the default lens. This isn't innocence. It's sophistication. It takes more emotional regulation to maintain openness than to maintain walls. Anyone can shut down. Anyone can decide people are terrible and be done with it. But to keep showing up with curiosity, to keep offering the benefit of the doubt, to keep believing in change, that requires a level of internal stability most people never develop. You're not being careless with your heart. You're exercising a form of disciplined hope. The paradox is that this makes you both more vulnerable and more resilient. More vulnerable because, yes, you'll be disappointed more often. More resilient because your sense of self isn't dependent on never being wrong about people. You can be hurt without being destroyed. You can be disappointed without becoming bitter. And that, more than anything, is what the cynics can't understand. They think you keep believing because you haven't learned yet. They don't realize you keep believing because you have. But of course, it's not always that clean. Sometimes this isn't wisdom. It's a wound pretending to be a worldview. Sometimes seeing good in others is really about needing to believe you live in a world where goodness is possible, because the alternative is too terrifying. Sometimes it's about growing up in chaos and learning that if you just believed hard enough, people would become who you needed them to be. Sometimes it's not faith. It's survival. And sometimes the belief in others is easier than the belief in yourself, easier to see potential in someone else than to sit with your own disappointment, easier to focus on their journey than to take responsibility for your own. The line between compassion and codependence isn't always clear. The line between hope and denial can blur in the dark. And yes, sometimes you give people chances they never asked for, trying to save them from themselves because once, maybe, you needed someone to do that for you. This doesn't make you wrong. It makes you human. Even our virtues carry the weight of our histories. Even our strengths have roots in our vulnerabilities. The goodness you see in others might be projection, but projection of what? Of the goodness you wish someone had seen in you. Of the grace you needed when you were struggling, of the belief that transformation is possible because you yourself have transformed. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the wound and the wisdom aren't separate things. Maybe you can believe in people for complicated reasons and still be right to believe. Maybe the fact that it comes from your own pain doesn't make it less true, because here's what matters. The belief itself, regardless of its origin, changes something in you, in them, in the space between. And that change is real, even when the reasons are messy. Believing in the good side of others isn't about being blind to the bad. It's about refusing to let the bad be the whole story. It's not innocence. It's a deliberate act of attention, a choice about where to invest your emotional energy. You're not denying that people can hurt you. You're refusing to let hurt become your primary lens. And that refusal, that insistence on maintaining complexity in your view of human nature, that's not weakness, that's fierce. Because here's the truth they don't tell you. Cynicism is easy. Cynicism is the laziest form of intelligence. It requires no discernment, no nuance, no courage. Anyone can assume the worst and be safe. Anyone can build walls and call it wisdom. But to remain open, to keep seeing potential, to hold space for people to surprise you, that takes strength most people will never access. That takes emotional musculature they've let atrophy. You're not naive for believing in goodness. You're trained in a form of attention the world is trying to kill. You're practicing a kind of emotional generosity that costs you something real. And maybe the people who call you foolish are really just uncomfortable with how much bravery that takes. Maybe their cynicism is their protection. And maybe your belief is yours. Different armor for different wounds. Neither wrong, just different. And sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is to refuse to become what the world expects, to live through betrayal and still show up with an open heart, to know the statistics on human cruelty and still choose to begin with trust. Not because you haven't learned, but because you've learned something deeper, that the person you become in response to darkness matters more than the darkness itself. There's a particular loneliness that comes with this. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of seeing the world through a lens no one else seems to use anymore. You watch people bond over shared cynicism, over stories of disappointment, over the ways they've learned not to trust. And you stand there holding something they've all agreed to put down. Sometimes you wonder if you missed the memo, if there was a meeting where everyone decided to stop believing and somehow you weren't invited. The exhaustion comes in waves. It's not just about being disappointed by people, though that happens and it hurts. It's about having to defend your way of being over and over again. Having to explain that yes, you know that person hurt you before. Yes, you see the pattern. Yes, you understand the risk, and still you're choosing to leave the door open, not because you're stupid, not because you didn't learn the lesson, but because closing the door means closing something in yourself you're not willing to lose. People will tell you they're protecting you when they encourage skepticism. They'll say they just don't want to see you hurt again, and maybe they mean it. But what they don't understand is that the hurt of disappointment is bearable. What's unbearable is becoming someone who can't believe anymore. What's unbearable is waking up one day and realizing you've let other people's betrayals teach you to betray yourself, to betray the part of you that still knows how to hope. And so you carry this alone sometimes, this strange faith in human potential that everyone else has filed away under lessons learned and never again. You carry it not because it's easy, but because putting it down would mean losing the part of yourself you recognize in the mirror, the part that makes you you. And that's not a price you're willing to pay, no matter how many times the world suggests you should. Here's what shifts when you understand this about yourself. You stop apologizing for it. You stop treating your capacity to believe as something that needs to be fixed or outgrown. You start to see it for what it is, a feature, not a bug. A form of perceptual courage that allows you to move through the world differently than most people can. Not better, not worse, just different. And different has value, even when the culture can't see it. You can start saying things like, I know this might not work out, and I'm choosing to try anyway. That's not naivety. That's radical clarity. You're not confused about the risks. You're making a conscious choice about how you want to show up in the world. You're deciding that your openness is worth more to you than your safety. And that's a grown-up decision, not a childish one. That's agency, not innocence. Or you can say, I believe in people's capacity to change because I've changed. I've been versions of myself I'm not proud of, and I grew. Why would I deny others that same possibility? This isn't projection. This is understanding that transformation is real because you've lived it. You're extending the grace you once needed, not because you're naive about human nature, but because you understand it from the inside. The language matters because when you can name what you're doing, when you can articulate that you're choosing hope as a practice, not stumbling into it as a mistake, everything shifts. You're no longer the person who just doesn't get it. You're the person who gets it completely and has made a different choice. You're no longer defending yourself. You're explaining yourself. And there's dignity in that. There's power in knowing exactly what you're doing and why. Studies on social perception reveal something fascinating. People who maintain this orientation toward others don't actually get taken advantage of more often. They just remember the disappointments differently. Their brains don't catalogue betrayals as evidence of a hostile world. They catalogue them as isolated incidents. Each disappointment remains specific rather than becoming universal. One person's betrayal doesn't mean all people will betray. One letdown doesn't prove that hope is foolish. This is what psychologists call a growth mindset applied to relationships. It's the ability to update your understanding of specific individuals without updating your understanding of humanity. You can learn that this person isn't trustworthy without concluding that trust itself is the problem. You can recognize patterns in someone's behavior without deciding the pattern defines all human behavior. Your sample size remains appropriately large. Your conclusions remain appropriately narrow. And here's the beautiful part. This actually makes you safer, not more vulnerable, because you're making decisions based on data, not trauma. You're responding to the person in front of you, not the person who hurt you 5 years ago. Your threat detection system hasn't been hijacked by past pain. You can still see red flags. You just don't see red flags where there aren't any. Your discernment is intact because your openness hasn't been destroyed. The research also shows something else. People who maintain belief in human goodness report higher life satisfaction, stronger relationships, and better mental health outcomes. Not because their lives are easier or because people treat them better, but because the story they tell about their experiences is fundamentally different. Disappointment doesn't confirm their worst fears. It's just information. Betrayal doesn't validate their worldview. It's just a thing that happened. And that narrative flexibility, that refusal to let pain become prophecy, is what allows them to keep living with their hearts open. But let's sit with the harder truth for a moment. Sometimes you give people more grace than they've asked for. Sometimes you see potential they have no intention of actualizing. Sometimes you're so busy believing in who they could be that you miss who they actually are, right now, in this moment. And that's not compassion anymore, that's avoidance. Avoidance of the grief of seeing someone clearly, avoidance of the anger you're allowed to feel, avoidance of the boundary you need to set. There's a version of this that isn't generous, it's enabling. When you keep believing in someone's goodness while they're actively harming themselves or others, you're not being kind, you're being complicit. When you offer chance after chance to someone who's shown you exactly who they are, you're not demonstrating faith, you're demonstrating fear. Fear of being wrong about them, fear of being the kind of person who gives up on people, fear of confronting your own judgment. And sometimes the belief in others is really a disbelief in yourself, a quiet conviction that you don't deserve better, that this is as good as it gets, that if you just believe hard enough, you can love someone into loving you back. That's not faith. That's a negotiation with worthlessness. That's trying to earn your right to exist by being understanding enough, patient enough, forgiving enough. That's performing grace, while neglecting the grace you owe yourself. So the question becomes, are you believing in people's goodness, or are you afraid of what it means if you stop? Are you extending compassion, or are you avoiding clarity? Are you seeing their potential, or are you refusing to see their present? These are hard questions. They don't have easy answers, but they're worth asking, because the difference between wisdom and wounding is often found in your willingness to interrogate your own motives. To ask not just what you believe about others, but why. Here's what integration looks like. You learn to hold both truths at once. You can believe in human goodness and still set boundaries. You can see someone's potential and still respond to their current behavior. You can maintain hope about humanity in general while being discerning about individuals in particular. These aren't contradictions. They're the mark of a mature faith, one that's been tested and refined, not one that's been protected from reality. You can say, I believe people are capable of change, and I'm not required to stay while they figure it out. That's not cynicism. That's self-respect meeting compassion. You're honoring their journey without sacrificing your own. You're believing in their capacity for growth, while acknowledging that growth happens on its own timeline, and you don't have to be present for all of it. You can wish someone well from a distance. You can believe in their goodness and still choose not to be available for their chaos. Or you can say, I see the good in you, and I also see what you're choosing right now. And right now, this doesn't work for me. That sentence holds everything. The belief, the boundary, the clarity. You're not abandoning your way of seeing. You're just refusing to let it override your reality. You're keeping your faith in human nature while also keeping your dignity. And that balance, that ability to believe without betraying yourself, that's what wisdom actually looks like. The practice becomes this: believe in people's goodness as a general principle, but respond to their specific actions. Trust humanity broadly, but evaluate individuals carefully. Keep your heart open to possibility, but keep your eyes open to reality. It's not about choosing between faith and discernment. It's about understanding that real faith requires discernment, that real compassion includes self-compassion, that you can honor what you see in people without dishonoring what you know about yourself, which part of you has the world never understood, but in quiet moments, when no one's watching, you've learned to honor anyway, that part that still believes, that still hopes, that still shows up with an open hand even when logic says to make a fist. What if that's not the part that needs to change? What if that's the part worth protecting above all else? If this gave you language for something you've always felt but never named, if it helped you see your supposed weakness as a form of strength the world forgot how to recognize, subscribe. Here we talk about what lives beneath the surface, about the patterns that shape us in ways no one taught us to articulate, about the parts of you that aren't broken, just misunderstood, about finding relief in recognition, not diagnosis. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to become what hurt you. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay soft. And sometimes believing in the good side of others is really about believing in the good side of yourself, the side that hasn't given up, hasn't closed off, hasn't let the world teach you that hope is for people who haven't learned better yet. You've learned. You've learned everything they've learned and more. You've just made a different choice about what to do with that knowledge. Not every absence is emptiness. Not every openness is vulnerability. And not every belief is blindness. Sometimes it's the clearest vision of all, the vision that sees what's broken and still sees what's possible, the vision that holds darkness and light in the same hand without dropping either one, the vision that knows the risk and walks forward anyway, because the alternative, becoming someone who can't believe anymore, is a loss you're simply not willing to accept. And maybe that's not naivety. Maybe that's the most sophisticated form of courage we have left.